Black nurse helped a millionaire businessman in the rain, then heard a voice that changed her life. Danielle Carter had never been a stranger to long hours or aching feet. For nearly 15 years, she had worked as a nurse, but in the oncology wing of St. Vincent's Medical Center, the job was more than exhausting. It was relentless. Every shift demanded not only her medical skills but her heart, her patience, and her strength. She had stood at the bedsides of countless patients, holding hands through nights of fear, whispering comfort in rooms filled with beeping machines, and silently carrying the grief of families who left with one less loved one. She had chosen this work because it mattered, because her father's battle with cancer had shown her that compassion could be as healing as medicine. But compassion didn't pay rent, and the bills that piled up on her kitchen counter told a story far harsher than the one she tried to live at the hospital. Danielle was a single mother, raising her 14-year-old son, Ethan, in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. Their home was modest, filled with second-hand furniture and the smell of whatever meal she managed to throw together between shifts. Ethan's laughter often filled the space, muffled by the thin walls, and for Danielle, that was enough to make the apartment feel like a haven. But even havens can crumble when the weight of survival grows too heavy. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. When she came home one late afternoon and saw the eviction notice taped to her door, her chest tightened with dread. The landlord wasn't bluffing. He wanted $7,500 within 3 weeks, or she and Ethan would be out on the street. That figure wasn't just beyond her reach, it was nearly impossible. Danielle had already been stretching every paycheck, taking double shifts, borrowing from friends when she dared. Now the walls were closing in faster than she could hold them back. She tried to shield Ethan from the fear gnawing at her, but children see more than they're told. He noticed the extra nights she was gone, the circles under her eyes, the way she flinched whenever the phone rang. He was old enough to understand the word eviction, but too young to carry the weight of what it would mean for their lives. The neighborhood around them was already changing. Families Danielle had known for years were disappearing, pushed out by rising rents and aggressive property companies snapping up every building in sight. The whispers at the corner store were always the same. People losing their homes overnight, landlords demanding impossible sums, tenants silenced because they lacked the money or power to fight back. Danielle had hoped she and Ethan might hold on a little longer, but the notice on her door made it clear. Their time was almost up. Still, Danielle carried on with her routines. She woke before dawn, packed Ethan's school lunch, and slipped into her scrubs. She drove the long commute into Manhattan, walking through the revolving doors of St. Vincent's with a practiced smile that hid the turmoil beneath. To her patients, she was steady and strong. To her colleagues, she was dependable, the one who never complained, the one who always took the overtime shifts nobody wanted. Only in the quiet moments, when she sat alone in the staff lounge or stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, did the cracks begin to show. And yet, through all of this, Danielle's compassion never dimmed. She still leaned close to frightened patients, still offered her hand to grieving families. Her heart had been trained by hardship, not hardened by it. But her kindness was stretched thin by the very system she worked for, a system that demanded endless labor yet offered little in return. The rain began to fall harder as autumn settled over New York. On certain nights, Danielle would drive home along Riverside Drive, the city lights blurred through her windshield, exhaustion making every mile heavier. She often thought about her father during those drives, about the nights she had watched him fade in a hospital bed, about the lessons he left her with, lessons about resilience, about humanity, about never turning away from someone in need. Those lessons guided her still, though they could not erase the mounting fear of losing everything she had worked to build for Ethan. It was during one of those drives, one storm-soaked night when the city seemed swallowed by darkness and thunder, that Danielle's world began to shift. She had no idea that the stranger she would see walking along the road, a man drenched in rain, clutching a leather briefcase as if it were the last solid thing in his life, would connect her struggles to a power she couldn't yet imagine. For now, all she knew was that she was tired, her gas tank nearly empty, and the clock already past midnight. Yet the smallest decision was waiting to be made, one that would test everything she thought she understood about compassion, survival, and justice. The eviction notice was still taped to her door. The rent was still impossible. But that night, in the middle of a storm, a single choice would draw her into a story far bigger than her own. And somewhere deep inside, she already sensed it. Nothing about her life was going to remain the same. The storm that night became more than a backdrop. It became the turning point. Danielle slowed her car when she saw the tall figure trudging along Riverside Drive, rain soaking his suit until it clung to him like a second skin. At first, her instincts screamed for her to keep driving. She was exhausted, alone, a black woman in the middle of the night, and the man was clearly someone out of place. But then she noticed his face, twisted in an expression that reminded her so much of her father's final days. Hollowed eyes, heavy grief etched deep, that she couldn't press the gas. Against her own caution, she pulled over. The man climbed in, drenched, clutching a leather briefcase like it was his lifeline. He introduced himself as Jonathan Hale, a name that meant little to Danielle at that moment. He was simply a man undone by loss, confessing quietly that his wife, Catherine, had died of cancer only months earlier at the very hospital where Danielle worked. The briefcase he held was full of her letters written as she prepared for the end, urging him to cling to humanity no matter how much wealth or power he had. Danielle dropped him off, thinking their paths would never cross again. But life, as she would soon learn, was not finished with either of them. 3 weeks later, the walls around Danielle began closing in. The eviction notice wasn't an empty threat. It was the opening move in a ruthless game. Crown Estates, the property company that owned her building, had tripled her rent overnight. What was once $4,000 a month became $12,000, an amount so absurd she thought at first it must be a mistake. She scrambled, borrowing from friends, begging for extensions, piecing together every dollar she could. By the deadline, she had $5,000, less than half of what was demanded. And Crown Estates made their position clear: pay in full or leave. The cruelty wasn't unique to her. She began noticing neighbors disappearing. Families who had lived in the building for years suddenly gone, their apartments stripped and renovated for wealthier tenants. Single mothers, immigrants, and the elderly were the first to go. It was discrimination masked as business, but the effect was the same, erasing lives that didn't fit into Crown Estates' profit margins. When Danielle dug deeper, what she discovered felt like betrayal carved into her very bones. Crown Estates wasn't just any company. It was a subsidiary of Hale Global Enterprises, the empire built by the very man she had stopped for in the rain. Jonathan Hale. The realization cut sharper than any eviction notice could. Had he known? Had she been nothing more than a passing stranger in his life, while his wealth funded the very injustice threatening hers? The thought left her shaken, but it also ignited something inside her. If kindness could connect their paths once, perhaps courage could cross them again. Determined to confront the truth, Danielle tracked Jonathan down. She found him at Greenwood Cemetery, where he visited his wife's grave every evening. He looked smaller than the man she remembered, bowed under the weight of grief. When she told him about Crown Estates, his face darkened, not with anger at her, but with realization of himself. He admitted that since Catherine's death, he had withdrawn from his businesses, leaving control to his executives, particularly Victor Lang, the director of Crown Estates. Jonathan confessed he hadn't known the extent of Victor's ruthlessness. But confession alone wasn't enough. Danielle pressed harder, telling him families like hers were being destroyed. She challenged him to take responsibility, not just as a grieving husband, but as the man whose signature still hung over every decision Victor made. Jonathan hesitated, torn between guilt and paralysis. It was Danielle who gave him clarity. You can either let his cruelty define your empire, or you can fight back and honor the woman you loved. That moment set them on a dangerous path. Together, they devised a plan. Danielle would bait Victor, pretending to negotiate about her eviction. She would record the conversation, capturing his words as proof. Jonathan, meanwhile, would go undercover, posing as an investor to gauge Victor's true intentions. The trap was risky. Danielle felt the fear deep in her chest as she dialed Victor, her voice steady while her hands trembled. He was slick, arrogant, and disturbingly candid. He spoke of driving out undesirable tenants, of raising rents until only the wealthy could remain. He laughed at the struggles of single mothers like her, dismissing their lives as collateral damage. Every word tightened Danielle's stomach, but she kept him talking, the recorder capturing it all. While she played her part, Jonathan entered Victor's office, dressed as an investor. He watched as Victor boasted about his methods, detailing how he maximized profits by targeting vulnerable communities. To Victor, tenants weren't people, they were obstacles. And with every sentence, Jonathan's anger boiled. The pieces of the puzzle were almost in place. The evidence was damning. But as Danielle prepared for the final confrontation, she knew the stakes had never been higher. She wasn't just fighting for her apartment anymore. She was fighting for Ethan's stability, for her neighbors, for every family silenced by discrimination hidden beneath corporate jargon. And yet, doubt whispered in the back of her mind. Could Jonathan truly be trusted? He was grieving, yes, but he was still the man at the top of the empire. If he turned on her now, if he chose loyalty to his company over her truth, she would be left with nothing but a stack of unpaid bills and a recorded call that might never see daylight. Still, Danielle couldn't turn back. The storm that began with a simple act of compassion was building into something far larger, and the thunder was getting closer. What would happen when the evidence came to light? Would Jonathan stand by her side? Or would she discover that even grief could not soften the heart of power? The answer, she feared, was waiting just beyond the next confrontation. The day of reckoning arrived not with fanfare, but with silence that carried the weight of storms. Danielle had prepared herself for this moment, though nothing could truly brace her for standing face to face with the man who had nearly erased her future. Victor Lang sat behind a gleaming desk in Crown Estate's headquarters, his smile sharp as glass, his eyes dismissive. To him, she was nothing more than another tenant too stubborn to break quietly. Danielle walked in clutching a folder thick with documents, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. She could still feel Ethan's worried eyes on her that morning, his quiet question echoing in her mind. "Mom, what if this doesn't work?" She had promised him she would fight, even though fear crawled beneath her skin. Victor leaned back, smug. He spoke in that same smooth tone she had recorded days before, dripping with arrogance. He reminded her that her eviction was already in motion. He told her resistance was pointless. He made it clear he saw families like hers as numbers on a balance sheet, expendable, replaceable. And then he said it outright. "We don't want people like you lowering the value of our properties." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Danielle's breath caught, fury burning inside her. But she did not flinch. She laid the folder on his desk and opened it slowly, page after page of evidence spilling across the polished wood. Fraudulent rent hikes, discriminatory policies, and, most damning of all, transcripts of the recording where Victor's own voice bragged about driving out single mothers and immigrants. Victor froze, his confidence flickering for the first time. But before he could speak, the office door opened. Jonathan Hale stepped inside. He wasn't the grieving widower she had once seen on a rainy night. Today, he carried himself with the steel of someone reclaiming his power. Victor's eyes widened. He had no idea that his investor from the week before had been Jonathan in disguise. The room seemed to shrink as Jonathan walked forward, Catherine's letters still tucked in the briefcase he carried. He placed it on the desk beside the evidence and spoke with a steady, unwavering voice. "I trusted you with my company," Jonathan said, his tone low but cutting. "And you used it to destroy lives." Victor sputtered, trying to regain control. He insisted it was business, that profits demanded hard decisions, that tenants were obstacles to growth. His words spilled faster now, desperate, reckless. But Jonathan silenced him with one final reveal. The meeting was not private. Behind the door waited witnesses. Journalists, lawyers, and city officials Danielle had alerted in secret. The moment Victor's voice rose in arrogant self-defense, they stepped in, hearing every word he used to justify cruelty. The air snapped with tension. Cameras flashed. Voices overlapped. Victor's downfall unfolded in real time, his empire of lies collapsing under the weight of truth. He shouted, he denied, he threatened lawsuits. But every word was another nail in his coffin. Every denial met with documents and recordings that left no room to escape. For Danielle, it was the moment she had dreamed of and dreaded. Her knees felt weak, her palms slick with sweat, yet she stood tall. She had walked into this room as a tenant begging for mercy. She now stood as the voice of every family silenced, every mother broken, every child displaced by greed disguised as business. Victor's arrest came swiftly. Officers entered, reading charges of fraud, corruption, and housing discrimination. His defiance crumbled into rage, his shouts echoing down the marble halls as he was led away in handcuffs. For the first time, Danielle exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. But the climax was not just Victor's downfall. It was Jonathan's transformation. As the cameras turned toward him, the world's gaze fell on the man whose name had once symbolized power and wealth. He didn't hide from it. Instead, he admitted his negligence, confessed to withdrawing from his company when grief consumed him, and vowed to reclaim his empire in the name of justice. Danielle watched him speak, her heart conflicted. Could a man with so much power truly change? Or was this just another performance? She wanted to believe it was real because the alternative meant their fight had been for nothing. As the journalists pressed in, Jonathan reached for the briefcase. He opened it and pulled out the final letter Catherine had written before her death. His hands trembled as he read aloud her words. "Never forget the power of kindness. Never let greed bury the humanity we once cherished." The room fell silent. Even the reporters, hungry for headlines, paused to let the words linger. For Danielle, it was confirmation that this battle was no longer hers alone. Something larger had begun, sparked by a single choice on a stormy night. And yet, as powerful as the moment was, the future remained uncertain. Victor's arrest would make headlines, but systemic cruelty did not vanish with one man in handcuffs. Families were still displaced, eviction notices still taped to doors, discrimination still whispered in the shadows of boardrooms. Danielle's victory was real, but it was only the beginning of a much greater fight. She stood in that office, surrounded by flashing lights and questions she couldn't yet answer, knowing one truth above all. Her life had changed forever, but so had Jonathan's. And what came next would decide whether their battle was a spark that faded, or a fire that reshaped everything. The cameras captured Danielle's face as she looked past the chaos and whispered silently to herself, a vow she knew Ethan would someday repeat with pride. This is only the beginning. In the weeks that followed Victor Lang's arrest, the story gripped New York City like a wildfire. Headlines splashed across newspapers, cameras replayed the footage of his downfall, and community leaders called for sweeping reforms in housing. But for Danielle, the impact wasn't measured in media cycles. It was measured in the quiet moments, in the relief on her son's face when he realized they would not lose their home, in the countless families who stopped her on the street to thank her for standing up when so many were too afraid to. Jonathan Hale moved quickly, perhaps driven by guilt, perhaps by love for the woman whose letters had guided him back to his humanity. Hale Global Enterprises issued a public apology, but more importantly, Jonathan overhauled its housing division from the ground up. Crown Estates was dismantled and rebuilt under new leadership, with policies ensuring that affordable housing was not just a token promise but a living reality. For Danielle, the greatest change came with Jonathan's unexpected offer. He asked her to take on the role of executive director of the newly created Catherine Hale Foundation, an organization named in honor of his late wife and dedicated to affordable housing and family support. At first, Danielle hesitated. She was a nurse, not a business leader. But Jonathan reminded her that leadership wasn't about titles. It was about compassion, resilience, and the courage to stand for those without a voice. And that, he told her, she had more than anyone he had ever known. The offer came with a salary that seemed unimaginable to her. $130,000 a year, with benefits and a guaranteed education fund for Ethan. But beyond the numbers, it came with something far greater. A chance to build change that lasted. Danielle accepted, not for herself, but for every family who still lived under the shadow of housing discrimination. 6 months later, the results spoke louder than promises. The Catherine Hale Foundation had already helped over 300 families secure housing. Mothers who had once faced eviction now held keys to apartments they could afford. Children who had been forced to move from school to school finally found stability. Danielle had become more than a survivor of injustice. She had become a leader, a force of hope woven into the city's fabric. Ethan saw it too. He would tell his friends proudly, "My mom helped a stranger in the rain, and now she's changing lives every day." To him, the eviction notice was no longer a symbol of fear but the spark of a story he could claim as his own. A story of resilience, justice, and transformation. Jonathan remained a presence, often visiting the Foundation's offices with Catherine's letters still tucked inside his briefcase. He carried them like a compass, a reminder of the humanity he had nearly lost. On one quiet afternoon, he shared Catherine's final letter with Danielle. In it, Catherine had written, "If you ever meet someone who reminds you of the kindness we once shared, don't let that encounter pass you by. Make it mean something." Danielle closed her eyes as the words sank in. Her act of kindness on that rainy night had rippled outward in ways she never could have imagined. It had saved her home, reshaped an empire, and touched the lives of hundreds of families. But most of all, it had reminded her, and perhaps everyone watching, that compassion, even when it feels small, can spark revolutions. Yet the story is not just about Danielle or Jonathan. It is about the system that allowed Victor to thrive for so long, the structures of racism and greed that strip families of dignity and security. It is about the silent injustices happening every day, unnoticed by cameras, unchallenged in boardrooms. Danielle's victory was extraordinary, but it should not be rare. And so the question remains, how many more families are still out there, staring at eviction notices, praying for someone to fight for them? How many more lives are being broken by policies designed to profit from pain? And how many acts of kindness, like Danielle's, are waiting to grow into movements if only we choose not to look away? Her story is a reminder, a challenge, and a call. Sometimes the smallest choice, a ride offered to a stranger, a stand taken against injustice, can alter the course of countless lives. So as you leave this story, ask yourself, what kindness might you offer today? What injustice might you refuse to ignore? And when the storm comes, will you keep driving, or will you stop, knowing that a single act of compassion might just change everything? If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on Danielle's journey. One act of kindness on a stormy night changed not only her life, but the lives of hundreds of families. It's a reminder that even the smallest choices can ripple outward in ways we can't imagine. What part of her story touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if you want more powerful stories like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.